you, Steve. So my name is Nadim Khoury. I'm a researcher in political philosophy. And my goal in this short presentation is to introduce you to the main theme of my research, which is a phenomenon I call narrative negotiation. Now, to explain what narrative negotiation means, let's take a simple intuitive example of two friends who fought and stopped talking to one another. This is familiar to all of us. Now, you can see the images here. They're not talking, and they're bold like me. I don't know why. It's a strange coincidence. Now, imagine after a couple of years, these two friends decide to reconnect and go over their differences. What would they do? Typically, they would get together, exchange each other's stories, versions of the facts. They'll talk about what happened, talk about their larger friendship and how the crisis fits within this friendship, and take the necessary steps to become friends again, right? You all know this. I hope so. Now, I call this narrative negotiation because there's a give and take between both stories. That's why these two people are negotiating. One person gives up on his past story, so the conviction that he was right, for example, and he will apologize and say, I was wrong. And he'll accept versions of the other person's story, and the other person will reciprocate, and they will reach some kind of common agreement that will allow them to move forward, a common narrative. Now, my research does not explore individuals seeking reconciliation, but nation-states seeking peace. I use the naive example of two friends because I assumed it will sound familiar to all of you. I hope so. I hope you all engage in successful narrative negotiation, unless you're horrible people. But, nobody's perfect, and not all friendships are meant to last. So my interest is the collective, groups fighting over narratives. So what happens when you move from the individual to the collective level? Now, obviously, there are big differences, right? The kind of conflicts between nations have nothing to do with the kind of conflicts between individuals. When you fight with your friend, it doesn't look like this. If it did, good luck. And also, when nations fight, they don't have a prior history of friendship to fall back on. It's always a history of war and violence. Steve's history of the British Empire and my Palestinian history have no common friendship in the past. Sorry, Steve. But there are similarities. Yeah, both nations and individuals share stories, narratives. So the American narrative, for example, this is the symbol of the American Revolution. Again, Steve. Declaration of Independence, American Revolution is a founding moment of their story. So they have stories just like individuals do. And these stories have tragedies and happy events and achievements and so forth. Now, when nations engage in war, they typically mobilize these memories and narratives to fight the enemy. So what you have at the end are some narrative wars, memory wars. Two nations mobilizing their collective memory to fight. And in this caricature, you have an example, a reference to the memory wars in East Asia. So China, Japan, Taiwan, and Korea fighting over history, mainly Japan's colonial history and its representation in the present. So it's mainly Japan getting all the hits, typically. And also another similarity is that when friends get together, they talk about their narratives, they negotiate them. Nations do the same. Historically, politicians would commission historians to come together from both parts and negotiate their stories for a future of peace rather than war. Now, I started thinking about these issues growing up in occupied Palestine with the peace process, thanks Norway, the Oslo peace process. And I was quite young at the time, and I don't think it all made sense, but retrospectively, it started making sense. All these issues of narrative, identity, and peace, and so forth. I knew, for example, that the conflict between Israel and Palestine is not only a conflict over geography and territory, but also a conflict over narrative and history. And I also knew that both insisted on their historical belonging of the land, and that they were both right, which makes the conflict so intractable. So the question is, given this intractable history and history of conflict, what happens when you go to the negotiating table? What happens to the past? If the future now is geared towards peace, what does the past look like? Can people negotiate history the way they are negotiating other agreements regarding territory, distribution of resources, and so forth? So this is the question that interested me. Peace, negotiations, plus very difficult history equals what the hell do you do? Now, as I mentioned, traditionally, and this has precedence, nations do engage in some kind of narrative negotiation. And as I grew up, I wanted to see what happened in the case of Israel-Palestine. So I examined how the Oslo peace process engaged in trying to solve the history of Israel-Palestine. Typically, the process is described as being pragmatic, involved only in the present, not with the past. But my research has shown that they tried to recreate two narratives, Israeli and Palestinian, that mirrors the geographic divisions, so that Palestinians and Israelis were asked to rewrite the history that corresponds to their new boundaries. Now, of course, what ended up happening is that the winner decided to call the shots, and the losers always lose. So history is always written by the winners, not only in times of war, but I realized also in times of peace. Now, I could end there on a very depressing note, and I will be, there's a comedian, and I will be the person who introduces tragedy into this, and even more tragedy. But I tried to think in what creative ways can we think of peace and memory in Israel-Palestine. And I started working on the links between the history of the Holocaust, which is a founding element in the Israeli narrative, but also Jewish history, and a very contentious issue in the conflict, and the Nakba, which is the Palestinian ethnic cleansing of 1948. These two events clash like no other. I mean, if you want to talk about clash of history, these two events are in real clash. So my research now is trying to think under what conditions and how can you think of these two events in a productive way, to try to think a new form of peace and memory. And all this is historically based, but I'm a philosopher, so of course my goal is to move from the historical and the concrete to more theoretical questions about justice, memory, identity, and reconciliation. And I'm in Tromsø to do exactly that, so wish me luck. Thank you.